Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the latest edition of the ESG Show, a weekly event in which we look at topical and important issues in ESG. A few technical problems this morning, so bear with us if there are any issues. And today we are going to be talking about ESG and AI. Now, the former world chess champion Garry Kasparov once said that technology is the reason most of us are alive to complain about technology. And he's right. We all complain about technology, but probably most of us wouldn't be around today without it. And nothing illustrates this more than AI. So today, as I said earlier, our theme is AI and ESG. Now, like a lot of people, I grew up watching dystopian movies about AI. And when I was a little bit older, but still quite young, I hasten to add, I remember watching a movie, which I'm sure most people have seen, featuring a naked Arnold Schwarzenegger coming back from the future to kill Sarah Connor. But when you speak to people who work in AI, not many of them really take that danger that seriously. I think that the reality is more subtle and nuanced than that. And they're more to do with the social implications of AI, the macroeconomic effect of AI. The fact, for example, that AI will probably create jobs as well as destroy jobs, but it might happen at a different pace. That the speed with which jobs are created won't be, or maybe a more serious problem might be a lack of skills. So jobs will be destroyed, new jobs will be created, but people won't be around to be able to do those jobs. So these are the kind of issues that you might have. But AI also presents a wonderful opportunity as well. For example, the speeding up of drug development that could cure diseases otherwise thought incurable. And I'm a great believer in this idea that you can't stop AI. The genie is out of the bottle. It's here. We have to embrace it, but we have to embrace it in a way that's as positive as possible and as much in our interest. Garry Kasparov once said, "Computer is better than human plus computer is better than computer," and I think that's right. We must embrace AI, or like a myriad of companies in the past which have failed to embrace a new disruptive technology, we will be disrupted either out of existence or at least into a pale shadow of what we could be. But AI also needs regulating too. And I think ESG is the great tool by which we can turn AI into a boon for humanity and not a curse. And joining me today on the ESG Show is a great journalist who I've worked with before, Robert Bateman.
Hi, Michael. Good to see you.
Hello, Robert. Good to see you too. So Robert is a writer, a commentator and advisor who focuses on data protection, privacy and related fields such as AI regulation. He has written over 1,000 articles on all aspects of data protection and is regularly quoted in the media as a trusted source of information on the topic. In addition to his writing, Robert also works as a freelance subject matter expert and training associate. So, Robert, AI regulation. So, do you reckon we need an off switch then?
An off switch? Well, I'm sure your tongue was in your cheek when you asked that question. Of course, there's no way to turn AI off without turning the entire grid off. And AI has many different forms. It's been used arguably for many decades in some contexts. What we do need, of course, are guardrails and to think very carefully about where we want to apply certain types of AI. So I'm sure we'll discuss that in more detail later.
Thank you very much, Robert. And we're also being joined by Sue Turner, who Robert is going to introduce to you.
Hi, Sue. So yes, this
Hi.
is good to see you. This is Sue Turner. And where are you joining us from today, Sue?
I'm in the UK, in the countryside near Bristol, so it's the southwest side.
So Sue Turner, OBE, is dedicated to using her expertise in AI and data governance and ethics to inspire organizations to use AI with wisdom and integrity. One of the first 14 people globally to be accredited in the Foundations of Independent Audit of AI Systems, and with both a law degree and an MSc in Artificial Intelligence and Data Science, she established AI Governance Limited in 2020 to advise businesses and policymakers on pragmatic AI, data ethics, and governance issues, and making a positive societal impact. Sue's career spans entrepreneurial private businesses and not-for-profit organizations, where she has led significant organizational growth, helped raise £27 million for charity, and collaborated to shift power to help people improve their prospects. So, Sue, you're very well qualified indeed to participate in this conversation. Tell me a bit about ethical AI. How can AI go wrong in that respect?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Good to be with you and with Michael today. And the phrase ethical AI is a kind of specific term for geeky people like me in the AI governance world, which we use to talk about principles and guidelines that ought to be applied to the responsible and moral use of AI. And over recent years, organizations around the globe have tried to kind of write down, codify what they mean by ethical AI, but there's no one definition that everybody's signed up to. So it means we're talking about things like ethics, bias, privacy, trust, and then wider issues around cybersecurity. But because there are enormous areas of how AI can impact society where there's no regulations, we don't really have at the moment, what ethical AI is really trying to do is get people to self-regulate, to foresee what harm their AI use might do, and then choose not to do some of those harmful things. And of course, that's tough. If you're a business leader, you see opportunities to make money, how are you going to turn those opportunities down? So that's what it's really all about.
Thank you, Sue. So, Michael, I believe...
yes, so hopefully we are about to be joined by Kerry. We have got a few technical issues, and I don't know whether we are going to be joined by Kerry. So something's happening, at least. Kerry, can you hear me all right?
Hi, Michael. Hi, everyone. I think signal's a bit in and out, but I'll do my best.
Okay, Kerry, we can't see you, but we can hear you. Kerry is a specialist in service design, development, implementation, and innovation, currently supporting the UK Civil Service. Kerry is also an award-winning and chartered public relations practitioner. She's a strategic advisor to the Alan Turing Institute, is working with the British Standards Institute on the development of global standards for artificial intelligence. Kerry's experience spans the UK's Prime Minister's Office, Cabinet Office, Home Office, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Health Tech, B2C and B2B sectors, including global brands such as Microsoft and Intercontinental. Kerry, a qualified machine learning developer and in AI for business, provides counsel to executive management teams on the adoption of new technologies and artificial intelligence. This includes the implications of AI, including ethics, opportunities for operations, citizens and customers, as well as culture change and people upskilling. Kerry also advises and trains on what is required from leadership in the new and emerging areas, including AI standards and AI regulation, how AI can help circumnavigate some of the challenges with ESG reporting. Kerry is an advisor to the Alan Turing Institute, and Kerry, by the way, has been nominated for an award, which is why she's talking to us remotely today, and which is why the camera, we're having problems with the camera. But Kerry, if you can hear me, hopefully you can, tell us a little bit about Alan Turing, the Alan Turing Institute, and just remind us what the Turing test is.
Hi, everyone. Everyone's heard of Mr. Alan Turing, forefather of AI, as he's known as. Born in 1912, died in 1954, and obviously spearheaded the UK's National AI and Data Institute, the Alan Turing Institute. You may have heard of the Turing test. So that was originally called the imitation game. And that came about early 1950. Alan Turing devised that. Obviously, Mr. Turing comes from a great mathematical background, known as a great mathematician. helped to break the code, the Enigma code, down at Bletchley Park, a living museum that we can still go and see today and learn lots. Now, there's a lot of talk in the AI world about the Turing test, and nobody's beating it yet. Or have they? Not so long ago, Google's AI Lambda passed the test, and also convinced a Google engineer of sentient not so long ago. You may recall, I think Google engineer ended up obviously not working for Google anymore, following some of the commentary in the media regarding it. So, yeah, so a quick summary of Mr. Alan Turing and why the Alan Turing Institute is so important in the UK landscape and globally today.
Okay, thank you, Kerry. And can your voice stay with us for a few minutes, even if you do not have the privilege of seeing your face? And can I just ask you a few questions myself? And so, Kerry, it seems to me that AI has important social implications for business, both good and bad. So how can we ensure genuine inclusion? Okay. I think we've lost Kerry there. I think what we'll do is we'll push on from to the next segment of the show, and which is a group discussion, which Kerry is meant to be involved with, but if she can't join us, she can't join us. And the subject of the group discussion is actually, before we move on, there was something I did want to discuss with Kerry, and I know that you've got some thoughts about this, Robert, as well. Perhaps we can just discuss this before we go on to the next topic. It seems to me that AI, it's all about data. The more data you have, the stronger the AI that you can build. And that's one of the reasons why, and indeed, so I'm sure you've got opinions on this as well. Meta, I believe, is one of the reasons why the Meta share price has done so well, because it has access to so much data. It seems to me that there is a British organisation that possibly has access to some of the most valuable data in the world, maybe the most valuable data in the world, and that organisation is called the NHS. Any thoughts about that, guys?
I'll chip in first.
Yes, please do.
So the UK public is very protective of the NHS, of course, for very good reason, and very concerned. Data protection and privacy don't make headlines that often, but when there's some overlap with the health service or with health in general, public seems to be more concerned. So the NHS has been using various third parties and service providers for sharing data with other companies for quite some time. And there's a lot of controversy around some of these arrangements. A company called Palantir is offering infrastructure services to the NHS, for example. I think there are a couple of key concerns in implementing AI into the health service. Firstly, privacy. So we need to be sure that such data is not reused for unrelated purposes than it's initially collected and processed by these companies. So this is one kind of quite vulgar and obvious consideration, but it's very difficult to achieve this. There are some technical ways you can anonymize data. Anonymization is a very high standard, though. Often the NHS makes a mistake in its public facing communications by referring to pseudonymized data, which is data that's had identifiers removed, as anonymous. Now, that's not the same thing under data protection law. So if we are going to allow service providers access to NHS data, there need to be very strict technical controls in place and contractual controls which prevent kind of selling, further selling of data and monetization. There are other broader ethical concerns in this area to do with what the purpose of using AI will be. So some things like appointment, prioritizing, vetting of patients in certain areas, we might not want to delegate those important decisions to AI. We might need to legally include some human in the loop for those sorts of important decisions. So those are some kind of broad considerations, putting to one side people's thoughts about some of these companies, Palantir, Foundry, for example, and Google, of course. Google had a legal case conclude quite recently in their favor around how the NHS shared data with DeepMind, which is an AI company bought up by Google a few years ago. So those are some kind of principles that should guide, I think, any involvement of AI or automation with regard to the NHS's very vast data set. If there is any profit to be made by third parties, it should be, I think, strictly for providing the services that are required of them, not for reusing this data, whether for training or reselling purposes.
Yeah, and
Okay.
if I just add to that, Michael, I think there has been a certain sort of hysteria, I think, around some companies like Palantir and just making this assumption that they can only ever do harmful things with our data. So I think, perhaps a bit of a more rational discussion would be a good thing. But putting that into context, actually, a lot of NHS data is still not even digital. So there's a lot of really, really good people in the NHS who have learnt huge amounts over the past 5-10 years about this whole area of informatics. How can we use clinical data and use that to inform decisions, and what tools and technologies can we use? So there's an amazing amount of goodwill in this. But there are still pockets of the NHS where the documentation is held on paper in a warehouse. So if you've got a consultant appointment, going into the hospital to see the consultant for some specialist diagnosis, first of all, we have to call off the physical papers from the warehouse and get them to the consultant before your appointment. So we've got a long way to go before all the data is there and ready to use. And I think we need to have a really informed public debate rather than some of these knee-jerk reactions to it. We saw that with COVID, where certainly in the UK and I know other parts of the world, people were really reluctant to use apps and other tools that the health authorities and government bodies put out there because they thought, no, it's my data. I can't let them, whoever they may be, know about what I'm doing with my data. So a more informed discussion is what we really need so that we can move on and get away from some of the knee-jerk on these things. Okay,
thank you. So in some respects, the NHS is still using 20th, 19th century technology, maybe, and we're trying to apply 21st technology to it. And Palantir, of course, is the company that Peter Thiel founded, I believe. Yes, okay. Perhaps we could turn now to our group discussion, which is on the topic of AI and the need for regulation. So, Robert, why do you think we need regulation?
Well, we've seen examples of what can happen with AI or a kind of broader class of technologies that we might include in the definition AI, where such applications have caused harm and do cause risk. And there's both individual risks when using AI and broader, I think, societal level risks that are perhaps less well understood, but more common. So, for example, I think that the use of live facial recognition technology, which is a use case for AI that's getting a lot of discussion at the moment, presents more of a sort of societal level risk than an individual risk. Personally, I don't experience much risk in having my face scanned by the police and matched to a database of criminal suspects, but I think there are societal level risks to consider with that sort of AI application, where it could change the culture and perhaps have a chilling effect on people's freedoms. Now, that's an individual use case, and there are points for and against that use of AI. More broadly, I think that it's just an area in which there is a lot of money to be made, and a lot of potentially harmful use cases. And I do think that businesses require both the carrot and the stick, as they sometimes say. I always thought that was a slightly confused metaphor, because the carrot's supposed to be on the end of the stick. But anyway, there needs to be some sort of punishment for misusing AI, and some sort of reward for using it in the right way, which of course is profit. Now, because AI is broadly defined in most, well, in the draft regulation that the EU is cooking about, it's very broadly defined. We need to determine, well, the approach that Europeans are taking is to think about the application of AI in different contexts. Where is it allowed? Where is it not allowed? Where do we have to have additional checks and balances? And where do we just need a bit of transparency? The low risk sort of use cases. I think there is cause to a good argument to ban the use of certain types of AI in certain situations, and but that is a sort of cautionary approach to the problem. Basically, we're trying to, as I'm sure Sue can talk about very eloquently, we're trying to reduce the harms that can result from AI. And I don't think you can rely on businesses to do that unilaterally. We can have an element of self-certification, and there is such a provision in the current proposed AI regulation, but there needs to be a framework via which businesses know where they stand and know what to do to achieve compliance. So those are some initial thoughts. I'm sure Sue can put it much more eloquently than me.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Sorry, Michael, I'd jump in. I think we could sort of think about the different types of actions that might lead to harm. So we could say deliberate action. If I deliberately set out to do something knowing that it's going to harm some section of society, and we can then think about the accidental harms and then the hidden harms. And I think regulation is, there are always going to be bad actors out there. There's always going to be people who try to purpose things for some use that wasn't thought of, and regulation can be there and they just ignore it, frankly. The middle group, I think the sort of accidental harms that are really interesting. I mean, when you think back to the creation of the internet, back in the 1990s, sorry, that was when it was created, that was when it became widely available to the likes of us. And the creation then of social media was a really fascinating thing, because there was this deliberate decision taken in California to exclude social media and other platforms from being regarded as publishers. Now, if they had been regarded as publishers, their duty of care, their legal liability for what they put out there would have been incredibly strict. But because those legal restrictions were not imposed, we are where we are with social media and the harms that it can produce. So I think it's incumbent on us as leaders now in the 21st century to learn the lessons from that and to recognize there will be people, companies that accidentally use this technology in ways that are really harmful for society. So how can we put those guardrails, as Michael said earlier on, Robert said it earlier on, they put those guardrails around use, which guide companies, guide leaders to take decisions in ways that are actually better for society rather than harmful. And that will inevitably encroach on profit. And if we get a chance later on to talk about what's happening in the European Union with the EU's AI Act, there are things there that some businesses would say, they're going to stop me making money. That's a terrible thing. But interestingly, at the UK Tech Policy Conference just last week, Brad Smith, who's Vice Chair and President of Microsoft, was talking, and he specifically said, we need some regulation. We need companies to step up and be responsible around their AI use, but we need regulation as well. And he cited things from the actual AI applications to the models that are used to build them, and also then to the infrastructure, the critical infrastructure that we need to support all of this. So there's lots of regulation to be thought about, and it needs a global approach. But again, we might come back onto that later on.
I would say as well, if I could just add one more point, a lot of AI use and development is already regulated, of course, under, for example, data protection regulation. We have rules around how data is collected for training sets and how data is processed for that purpose, how AI is applied in some particular situations with legal effects, for example, to make loan decisions, legal decisions, and so on. And we've already seen data protection regulators clashing with AI providers, like the Italian data protection authorities run in with OpenAI over ChatGPT, which led to OpenAI actually restricting Italian users from ChatGPT for a period. And just today, the Data Protection Commission in Ireland has said that Google has to stall the rollout of its Bard chatbot because of data protection concerns. So there are already requirements that I think, to be honest, are not largely being met by AI developers regarding how data is collected and how AI is applied. I do think we need additional AI-specific regulation, but the UK's proposed framework that I think they are rethinking now would have just used those existing laws and existing regulators and apply them on a kind of sector-by-sector basis. So there is already quite strict regulation around a lot of the stuff that goes into AI and a lot of the stuff that comes out of AI systems in the form of decisions and personal data. But a lot of that is kind of being ignored, or enforcement is quite piecemeal at the moment. So I think that's worth mentioning too.
Okay. We've had a couple of comments. So Zoe Manta Buckley said AI such as GPT and similar software seems pretty unregulated at the moment. I think that we are making advancements at a quicker speed than we can decide how to control it. Already AI videos with celebrities. If AI is in the wrong hands and we get to a scenario where we cannot differ between AI and human mode, well, that's her concern. Any observations of that? Is it happening too fast?
It always does. I think this is the thing with technology, that if you look at any period of technology bubbling up, and we as humans are brilliant at being creative and inventing new things. Regulation, though, is a different mindset. It's not a creative mindset. It's a deductive mindset. So it's trying to reduce things to their key elements and then see how they might be controlled. So it takes time, and particularly in the context of AI, where I don't think there's much point in countries trying to regulate individually. I think this has got to be a global approach, because this is more akin to weaponry, for example, not to be hyping the whole thing up. And, I don't want to get into the whole existential risk argument, because I don't think that's a real one that concerns us today. But it is potentially very damaging, and it's universal. So the way we're developing the technology in the UK is broadly the same as the way it's being developed in Italy or America or India or anywhere else. So we've got to have regulations that make sense globally. And that is really slow. You look at what's happening, I'm sure we'll come on to it, but climate change rules and regulations and how they've evolved. It's taken a very long time to get us where we are today. But we can't afford for AI, taking Zoe's point, we can't afford for AI regulation to take 20, 30 years, because there are harms happening today and we need to get on top of those. But I think that's a real challenge for regulators. I spent a lot of my career in the government relations world, so I've seen the other side of it. How do regulators put the policies together? And it's slow, and I don't think they've got the skills or indeed the mindset to rush at this. And perhaps if they rushed at it, they'd make mistakes anyway, so perhaps we don't want them to go too quickly.
Okay, so I'm aware that time is pressing on, and there was one question that I really wanted to address, which is what do business organisations of all sizes need to know?
Yeah, shall I take that one first? I think there's
sure.
Yeah, huge amounts to learn. I mean, the AI governance, we put out some research last year which showed that 58% of organisations have got nobody on the board who even understands what AI is, let alone how they might use it. And 91% of organisations have got no controls around their AI use. So this is quite a scary picture. So leaders in organisations, first of all, need to get skilled, need to actually get the knowledge to understand what these tools are, what they might do with them. And then secondly, what are the risks? What could go wrong? And how can they mitigate those risks, control them, and then accept whatever residual risks are left over? So there's a massive, massive education piece to do. And then the second part I always talk to business leaders about is, what are you going to do if your use of AI actually ends up being something that's regulated out of existence? So you could be setting up a use of AI at the moment, only to find in a few years' time that you can no longer do that. So, for example, go back a couple of years, companies were using technology in interviewing candidates for jobs, which in theory could predict from facial expressions all sorts of things about that job candidate. It's been shown now that the science behind that, the science that says there's a universal set of facial expressions, is rubbish. It's not true. So AI models were built on something that fundamentally just was fiction. So now people don't use that, or I hope they don't. I mean, most of them don't, but I'm sure there's somebody still out there who thinks there's science behind it and is using it. So if AI can't find a pattern, because there isn't a pattern there, then it's not going to work. So you've got to, as a leader, ask a lot of questions about the AI use that's being sold to you or developed internally in the business, and have enough knowledge and wisdom to be able to answer the questions. And then the far sight and ethical standards to be able to say, I could do this with my technology, but actually, ethically, I don't think I will. And that hopefully will keep you on the right side of whatever regulations come down the track in the future.
Okay, thank you. Robert, do you have anything to add to
that? If I have a minute, I'm very glad to hear Sue disparaging the emotional recognition systems that vendors were flogging a few years ago and have now fallen out of favor. I think I hate to keep coming back to data protection, but AI is intrinsically linked with personal data. And whenever you're doing anything with personal data, you need to consider whether you need to do this. So if there is an easier way to do it, if you're making very small gains or perhaps none at all, then perhaps AI is not appropriate for the use case you've designated it for. When ChatGPT first came out, was quite excited by it. It is very good as a chatbot, not reliable, but I used it a bit here and there to write the odd thing. I then realized I was spending more time checking it, editing it than I needed to. I never used it for professional purposes, but it just seemed that it wasn't really necessary for me to use it. So I don't really use it anymore. I think businesses need to take that very careful, considered approach. Don't rush in to using this stuff when the legal status is quite ambiguous as it is, let alone considering what's coming down the track in terms of regulation, like Sue says.
Okay, we've had a few comments in. I just want to very, very quickly cover them. And I think they show the sort of the good and the bad, really. We've had a user that says, yeah, it could be beneficial. The problem is that we misuse the data for some reason. Electronic data is not well protected from breaches, something I know you feel very strongly about. But it could also reduce the busy work that so many employees face. This is almost like a Jekyll and Hyde of AI, is there?
Yeah, and that's where the wisdom and integrity comes in, isn't it? It's just because you can doesn't mean you should. So you've got a tool that, exactly as that commenter said, could reduce some of the work that goes on that keeps us all busy, but actually should we be using it for that? So, for example, a lot of what managers in organizations do is just translate and collate information about what other people in the organization are doing and then feed it upwards. Now, that potentially is a really good use of AI, to be detecting from what we're all doing, typing on our keyboards, interacting through our various communications channels, that can detect what we're doing, how we're spending our time, link that to effectiveness, link that to targets and objectives and so on, and produce some really nice dashboards that show the upper levels of an organization what's actually going on. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to get rid of all the managers in organizations, but it does mean if you're a manager in an organization, you've got to get wise to these tools and figure out how to use them in a way that makes you actually add value, rather than you trying to compete with the tool and hold on to your job. You're not going to compete with the tool. The computer processing power is so much faster than what we can do. So we need to accept that the tools are there, harness their power, and then show how we as humans add value and context to the data that they produce.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to duck out of the conversation for a few minutes now. Robert's going to be having a chat with Sue, a little bit more specific to ESG and AI. Guys, we've got 5 minutes on this topic. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So Sue, you can tell me, because I'm no ESG expert, as you probably gather, my expertise is quite restricted to one particular area. So why don't you tell me a bit about what AI and ESG have in common?
I was quite surprised by this when I started looking at it about a year and a half ago, because I had an interest in the G bit, the governance bit, and the social bit in the past. And so I started looking at what AI and ESG were doing that was on parallel tracks, if you like. And I found that they had a huge amount in common. I mean, potential to do good, to change the world for good is clear in both of them. The hype and the existential threat, is it real, is it not real? The questions being asked around that. Obviously, much further ahead in the ESG world, we understand the threat better. In the AI world, it's lagging behind, but there's still that sense of threat there. And that leads on to real worries. We are really quite worried about what these things could do and how do we control them. Lack of standards, again, whether that's locally in different countries or globally, again, they've both got that in common, that people are trying to do the right thing, but the standards aren't being set in a clear way that means we all know what we're supposed to do. And frankly, the potential for lots of talk and not much action. We've seen a lot of that over a period of time in ESG, and we've seen the greenwashing bubble pop up and hopefully be popped and put back in its box. But the same with AI. I think we'll find a lot of talk over the next couple of years about people saying, yes, we're using these tools responsibly, but without actually having ways to prove that or standards to operate against. So I think we can do a lot of good, as I say. So you can use AI tools in conjunction with environmental tools, reducing energy consumption, for example. But we need to be conscious about the flaws and the time that we're taking to get into grips with these tools. And I think in both of them, the other parallel is that there's a common factor of not really paying that much attention to the social side. So ESG is quite often the S is the forgotten bit in ESG. And when I'm doing executive education and board development sessions, I talk to leaders about the social impact of their ideas for using AI. Quite often it's like I'm talking a new language to people. So we need to be getting people more aware of that S part and how they can actually do some good with these tools too.
Good. So you alluded earlier to this idea that has been propagated partly by AI CEOs, that AI represents an existential risk on the level of climate change. Now, do you think that comparison between AI and climate change is superficial because they're both global issues that require some global coordination and they're both difficult problems to solve? Do you think that link between AI and climate change is superficial, or is there a deeper comparison to be made there?
Yeah, it's a good question to think through. I think when I first started thinking about it, I thought it was superficial and it was just, attractive as a headline, but nothing much deeper. But actually, the more I've thought about it, the more I've thought that there are actually real deep connections between the two. So at the numerical level, we've got some common factors. So they're tough issues. They're difficult to control for sure. But some estimates actually think that the tech sector, as it grows, is going to be more damaging in terms of CO2 emissions than the airline industry. And you think about the focus we've got on the airline industry and coming to grips with different ways of controlling emissions there, we've not got the same focus on the tech industry at all. And timescales, I think, really are telling on this one. Way back in, I think it was 1988, wasn't it, the first intergovernmental panel on climate change, a long time ago. And it really took until 2015 in the Paris Agreement to bring forward serious proposals to limit warming. Concept of AI has been around since the 1950s, but regulations only just now emerging. International regulations we touched on earlier on, it's probably years in the making. So I think if I'm being an optimist, I'd say that I hope AI will learn from climate change and find ways to speed up this process of getting global agreement on standards, on regulations. But I think politics has its own pace and events, they get in the way of common sense and taking action. So AI can definitely be part of the solution to some climate change issues. We can predict the effects of climate change better. We can develop strategies to mitigate the impacts. And perhaps when we come on to social impacts, we'll say some more about that as well. Inequalities are really interesting. If you look at the disadvantaged communities that are affected by climate change, so much more than advantaged communities. The same thing, I think, will happen with artificial intelligence as well. So yeah, the links between AI and climate change are really quite fundamental and quite deep. And just to conclude on that one, ultimately what it comes down to is there's a very small number of people that are in control of some of the big levers on both climate change and AI. And that's got to be a worry for all of us.
Good, thank you, Sue. That's very well put. I think there are many different parallels between the problem of regulating or developing safe AI and combating climate change. I think we are due to bring Michael back in now and have a look at some news stories. Is that right, Michael?
Yes, it is indeed. We're running low on time, but we've got enough time to cover a couple of news stories. In fact, Robert, I think there's one story that caught your interest about the Atlantic Declaration.
So this is now. I will try not to be too cynical in my description of this story. So Sunak and
Robert, it's good to hear you being cynical.
So Sunak and Biden, or the US and UK executives, have hashed out some sort of declaration about how the US and the UK can work together on some of these big, mostly kind of digital related issues. So there's a few statements here that are, for the time being, quite woolly. And there is one in particular that I know is probably more substantial. So there's a lot of stuff about, there is some stuff about climate change, which is not strictly technically directly related to technical matters, but there's going to be some sharing of climate analysis, I believe, and some cooperation on climate change efforts, and also some AI related proposals. I think there's some sort of summit going on soon in London involving lots of big AI companies, not too much representation from academia or civil society, I noticed, but lots of big tech and small tech firms coming over to London for that. There's also this data bridge. Now, this is a real thing, the UK-US data bridge, which is what's called an adequacy agreement under data protection law. So it's going to be a way for UK companies and US companies to share personal data, where there are rules in place to restrict that sharing now. Under this agreement, those would be loosened up. Now, the EU and the US are going through this process right now. It's a very long and painful thing for those of us watching EU and US data protection kind of diplomacy. The UK, I think, will likely copy and paste the EU's agreement here. So when the UK takes credit for this, please take that with a pinch of salt, because we are following on the EU's coattails. But this is, of course, relevant to AI in many respects.
Okay, and this ties in with the EU regulation that was in the news this morning, Sue.
Yes, as we speak, the EU are having a press conference because their EU AI Act is at the next stage of discussion today. It's actually being discussed by the European Parliament. And this is where we see politics and regulation, meeting where the rubber hits the road. So they've got this sort of theoretical way of regulating AI, which, some people would say it's over-regulation, others would say it's not enough, but it is what it is, and it's there to be used. But the politicians now are having this argument. So some of them on the right of politics are saying that things like facial recognition should be allowed if, for example, security forces, police forces want to use it. Others on the left of politics are saying no, it should be completely outlawed across the EU. We shouldn't have it. So it really just shows you how you can get this sort of tug of war going on with politics rather than asking the people, what do we want? So I think the exemptions for law enforcement may not go through, but even so, there'll be more stages, more discussions across the EU before we get to the final position where we can know what are the banned uses of AI, what are the ones that are going to be deemed high risk, what are the ones deemed low risk, and the others, which hopefully will be the majority, not deemed to be risky at all. So yeah, a way to go before we see how that pans out.
So do you think they'll deliver this year? I believe they're pushing for that.
Well, they've been talking about bringing the implementation deadline forward 6 months because of the point that the questioner made earlier on about how fast things are changing. So I think that's probably going to be a push that focuses their minds to try and get it completed sooner rather than later. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. It's you've got the fantastically slow process of regulation versus the incredibly fast processor changing AI, and it's quite a challenge, isn't it? There's another story that caught my attention, and it was brought to my attention, in fact, by Caroline McGee on LinkedIn, who was responding to the post that we put up about this very show. And the article in question is looking at the usage of fresh water by AI programs. AI programs consume large volumes of scarce water. So what's going on there, Robert? I didn't realize AI was so thirsty.
Well, it's like any data center requires huge amounts of power, huge amounts of water to cool the equipment, and AI is just one example, really. It's particularly heavy processing, requires a lot of processing power, but it's also like cryptocurrency, for example. Proof of work, cryptocurrency required a lot of energy too. Now, the interesting thing about this for me is, I think, and I've heard others express this too, that these physical, environmental concerns might represent a ceiling in AI development. There's a question as to whether you can just chuck more and more GPUs at a transformer model and improve its capacity for learning. But even if you can do that, there is a limit to how many raw materials we have and how many it will be. Is there a peak silicon that we're going to reach at some point? Do we have enough chips to throw at AI models so that they keep improving? Or will we have to find other ways to make them more efficient? So when we're thinking about AI advancing, there is a school of thought that it might not actually go that much further. And this could be one of the reasons for that. There's not enough energy and it's not economical to do so. So I'm not subscribing to that view necessarily because I don't have the technical know-how to do so, but that is a food for thought, I think.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, and you've got about 2.5 minutes to unpack it.
Right. Yeah. Well, on that last point about the processing power, I was listening to a presentation last week in London about quantum compute, and that may be the key that unlocks this different way of processing and changes things, and perhaps even takes us into the existential risk area. So we'll park that one for now because we don't know. But yeah, in terms of just building a large language model like ChatGPT, they reckon it can take the equivalent of a year's worth of energy 120 years worth of energy for a US household. So, or 120 households years worth of energy, whichever way you want to look at it. And then actually using the model, they say that can take in a month the same energy that somewhere between 10,000 and 150,000 people use. So there's definitely the energy side is a real problem. And as we've said, cooling's the issue there. But there's a fascinating story that there's sort of an adjunct to this, which is that there are experiments around the world of actually putting these data centers into the sea. So you've got the natural cooling environment of the water around them. So you don't need energy to pump in and out to remove the heat. You can actually just use the water around a sealed unit of a data center to be the cooling. So that's been experimented with in China, off America, off the coast of Scotland as well. So perhaps we'll see something that is more sustainable. If you can imagine, you've got wave power generating the energy to service the data center, and then the natural cooling happening. Perhaps we can get to something that's more sustainable if, as Robert says, we can get the right minerals and other technical detail that we need to go in there to produce the chips and the GPUs in the first place. So yeah, lots of developments to happen, and a lot of brain power going on thinking about new ways of approaching this rather than just iterating from where we are today.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're very, very low on time. I was going to ask you a couple of other questions. I wanted to make some comment about the cloud and how can we go above the cloud and go into the stratosphere and have solar-powered servers stored up there where it's naturally very, very cold. But you can answer that, but you've got 10 seconds to answer it. Can you answer that in 10 seconds?
I think that might be an issue with trailing the cables back to the earth.
We'll beam the data up and back, yeah, and then some bad actor will get in the way and interrupt it, or it rains, thunder, who knows? Yeah. Okay,
well, thank you very much, guys. Next week, the ESG show is going to be on a little bit later because we are teaming up with the Strategic the Sustainable Strategic Planning Conference, and we have got a speaker from the West Coast of the United States, a speaker from Vancouver, and a speaker from Jamaica. So it'll be 3 p.m. BST next week, 2 hours later. And we're pretty much out of time, actually. So thank you all very, very much for joining us, and see you all next week. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.